Bonjour, bonjour, and thank you so much for joining me for episode 5 of an all-new recording of Paris in Bleu Blonde Rouge. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've been trying to record this now 5 times, and I don't know what is happening with the website I'm recording it on. It ends up stopping after about 10 minutes, and although I keep talking. So we're going to try this again. And so I wanted to share today with you the story of the fire that affected the Louvre on February 6, 1661. Now, last week I shared the story of the carpets that were created under Louis XIV that were on display in the Grand Palais for 1 week only, the first time ever since they were created, when 31 of the 93 were added, and one of the carpets as well that had belonged to the Galerie d'Apollon. So it was in the early morning of February 6, 1661, when a fire raged through what was described as the most beautiful gallery in the world. 350 years ago, a Sunday morning marked a turning point in the history of the Louvre in the same place that made news 4 months ago. The year 1661 was pivotal in the life of Louis XIV. After the death of his closest advisor and godfather, Cardinal Mazarin, he would seize control of the government, and the grand story of the Sun King began. He was just 22 years old. Before his death, Cardinal Mazarin influenced everything from the people who had access to the king to the design of the royal buildings and even amassing the royal collection. In the 1650s, when the architect Louis Laveau Mazarin sought to expand the Palais du Louvre, he included a theater, library, and galleries for the king's buildings, sculptures, and other art objects. It's hard to imagine the Louvre of the 16th and 17th centuries when you look at the massive structure that spread over the center of Paris today. Originally a medieval fortress built at the end of the 12th century by Philippe Auguste into the wall that surrounded the city. In 1367, Charles V transformed it from a fortress to a palace, adding large rooms, a library, gardens, and even windows. We could thank Francois I for the creation of the Louvre, which we know today. Upon his arrival in Paris in 1515, he made the palace his official residence, but it hadn't weathered the years well and was in need of a massive restoration. Francois tasked architect Pierre Lescot with creating a palace that would reflect France's glory. Francois had the former palace destroyed, and the new one was built in its place using many of the same stones. You could still see the base of the medieval palace in the basement of the Louvre when it was discovered in 1984. Francois' son, Henry II, would take on the role as a builder after his death, extending his vision and completing the central crossing of the Sully Wing, the Pavillon d'Horloge, and the King's Pavilion that overlooked the Seine. Henry II's death in 1559 led his wife, Catherine de' Medici, to build her own palace in the countrysides of Paris in the Palais des Tuileries. As we discussed last week, it was her son-in-law, Henry IV, who would then build the long bordelot extending from the Palais du Louvre to the Tuileries, an idea she had wanted to pursue before her death. However, Henry IV first had to expand the same palace into a structure to be attached to the Long Gallery. Historians are unsure of the year the Petite Galerie was built, but it could date back as early as 1566 under Catherine de' Medici, although it hadn't reached much further than a portion on the ground level. Over the next 40 years, her 3 sons held the throne and did more harm than good for the palace. It would be one of my favorites, Henry IV, that would take on the role of the greatest creator of the Louvre at the end of the 16th century. The Petite Gallery was built steps away from the King's Pavilion, which housed his chambers and his closest advisors. Under Charles IX and Henry III, the building was only one level, and the upper level was nothing more than a terrace that the king could use to take the view of the Seine. The marriage of Henry IV to his second wife, Marie de' Medici, in the fall of 1600 was the push they needed to upgrade the palace. The Medici family was used to luxury, and the Louvre was far from it. After their first meeting after their wedding in Lyon in November of 1600, they eventually arrived in Paris in February of 1601. Her first view of the Palais du Louvre was in the dark of night on February 15th with nothing more than a few candles lit. It might have been a strategic move on the king's part, but one he would have to deal with when the sun came up. The Petite Gallery was a freestanding structure with windows on either side and a small passage over the moat to reach the king's pavilion. The first version of the gallery is not much more than a small passageway used solely by the king and his family. Work on the first floor was undertaken between 1601 and 1607. The exterior was decorated with reliefs dedicated to the king's glory, depicting genius and victories, as well as allegories of the arts and sciences. On the western exterior, the relief of Henry IV with peace and abundance at his side. The interior of the Petite Gallery is somewhat unknown in terms of the exact details, but we do have a few accounts from visitors who described it as the most beautiful in the world. Henry IV chose his geographer, Antoine de Laval, to lead the design of the Petite Gallery and would later be known as the Galerie des Rois. De Laval's plan would center on mythological and allegorical figures that signify the king's strength and virtues. Artist Toussaint Dubriel was already well-versed in what Henry IV wanted. He had worked on the Château de Fontainebleau and the Château Neuf de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where he was given carte blanche on anything he wanted to create. De Laval was a bit worried about this and wanted to rein in Dubriel and control the design of the ceiling. In the end, the favor went to Dubriel, who also worked within the ideas and Antoine de Laval. Ovid's Metamorphosis was the main theme, focusing on the figures of Perseus and Andromeda, Pan and Sphinx, and Jupiter and Danae, many of which were painted with the face of Henry IV. Sculptors Barthélemy Tremblay, who was also Toussaint's brother-in-law, was creating large figures for the vaults, including victories holding the coat of arms of France and Navarre, each standing over 8 feet tall. The walls were decorated with 28 paintings of the kings and queens of France, beginning with Saint Louis and Marguerite de Provence and ending with Henry IV and Marie de Medici. The complete list is unknown, and the 6 would be missing from a chronological order. We do not know the kings that filled the western wall, but we do know that they filled within the 12 piers and windows on each side and the corresponding queens on the eastern wall. Henry IV and his bride were the first to greet you as you enter from the Salle Ovale, today's Rotonde. Surrounding each of these royal figures were as many as 12 to 16 smaller paintings of key figures and places of their reign. Toussaint Dubriel died on November 2nd, 1602, and the work continued under Jacob Bunel. Dubriel left behind sketches and cartons of his work to be carried out by his atelier and Bunel, including the idea behind the large portraits. Sadly, very few of these sketches survive. Commissioned on May 22, 1607, Bunel and his wife, Marguerite Bauche, traveled around France, visiting the chateaux and churches to find images in art and stained glass of the former rulers and their court to use as a basis for the paintings' figures. A sketch attributed to Bunel can be found in the Louvre archives depicting Henry IV standing full length in the center beneath an arch. On either side of the king are oval portraits, the Dauphin Louis XIII on his right and his daughter Elizabeth on his left. Other sketches by Dubriel that survived, including one of the central figures, which could be Henry IV, under the trameau or mantle, surrounded by 4 smaller portraits, and his royal cipher of the letter H topped with a Bourbon crown. While other accounts mention the paintings around could also have been landscapes and chateaux of the sovereign's reign, as well as verses, inscriptions that hung from the ceiling. It all sounds a bit chaotic, as well as a massive undertaking. The paintings of the sovereigns came from the initial vision of Toussaint and carried out by Jacob Bunel. Historians also believe that it was his wife Marguerite that painted the life-size depiction of the queens of France that once hung on the walls across from each king. Marguerite was born around 1570 and raised surrounded by art of her father Antoine. She married Jacob in 1595. They moved to Paris in 1599. His father had been the painter for Henry IV, and after his death, Henry asked if he wanted to come to Paris to work for him. Installing the couple into the ground floor below the Grand Gallery, they worked closely with the king, bringing his vision to life. Jacob died in 1614, and Marie de Medici, now regent, kept Marguerite on and even bestowed the same title of Painter of the King. She allowed her to stay within the Louvre, continuing to work with Marie. Marguerite was far ahead of her time and was given the opportunity the women were never given, even 200 years later. Little remains today in regards to how the Petite Galerie was originally decorated, but the account of the English traveler Thomas Carrot was maybe the one person that saw it and described it better than anyone. He visited in June of 1608, which had been close to the completion of the ceiling and the walls. He writes in his published journal, I then entered a room which, in my opinion, is not only the most beautiful thing in the world today, but also the most magnificent thing that has ever been seen since the earth was created. He continues on, the description of which would require a large volume in and of itself. It is divided into 3 parts, 2 end sections, and between them a very long and very spacious promenade. The vaults of admirable beauty and brilliance is carved with paintings in the antique style, gods and angels, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, and the signs of the zodiac. So beautiful one cannot imagine unless one has seen it with their own eyes. The description sounds more like the ceiling that would become what it was transformed in after the fire, but still beautiful nonetheless. A different account comes from the memoir of Louis-Henri de Lomenier. He wrote that when he saw the room shortly before the fire, that the ceiling represented the defeat of the Titans by Jupiter, a large and beautiful piece of allegorical paintings in which Henry IV appeared under the figure of Jupiter and the league struck under that of the giants reduced to power. Sadly, we don't know for sure. On October 22, 1660, Carlo Viaggiorani, the intendant of the King's Pleasure, quite the title, an Italian scenic designer, sent a letter to Girolamo Graziani, an Italian poet, on behalf of the king to design a series of entertainment for the court during the rainy season, as well as creating a new stage and theater within the Gallery of Kings. A structure that would be covered in tapestry was completed a month later. In January 1661, the first performance of École Alente by Francesco Butti, a play based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, was performed. Performed to great reviews, the next production was planned a month later. At the end of January, it was announced that Marie-Thérèse was pregnant with what would hope to be an heir to the throne, and a celebration was planned, including a performance in a ballet which the king himself would dance and play the lead role. The Impatience was composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully and on a libretto of Isaac de Bensardier and Francesco Butti, was to debut on February 11th in the Galerie des Rois. Working around the clock to complete the scenery and stage, a single worker had remained on the night of February 5, 1661. Torches lit the space during the long, dark nights of February, when the single worker hurried to finish the stage. He fell asleep early in the next morning with a torch near a pile of wood waiting and caught fire. And the flames quickly climbed the walls and spread through the attic. In the nearby King's Pavilion, Cardinal Mazarin was awoken by the guards as his chamber filled with smoke. The cardinal had become very weak and sick over the past few months and was carried down the steps of the Escalier Henri II in a chair by his guards. Quickly taken to his palace a few blocks away, the Palais Mazarin, now Bibliothèque Nationale. He was deeply shaken by the fire and would die a month later on March 9, 1661. By 9 a.m. on the morning of February 6th, the flames ravaged the entire Galerie des Rois, destroying everything in its path. The Grand Gallery, which began just outside the door of the Galerie des Rois, was damaged before the flames were controlled. We can all recall watching the valiant effort of the firefighters on April 15th, 2019 at Notre Dame. But in the year 1661, they weren't as lucky to have the equipment we do today. Without hoses or water pumps, they had to rely on buckets of water, past Escalier Henri II, and maybe a little divine intervention. First on the scene that Sunday morning were the monks that were lodged across this river in the Couvent de Grand Augustin. Accounts depict many of the monks jumping into the fire and pulling burning beams out to slow the spread. The Swiss guard and courtiers joined the monks, passing buckets of water to extinguish the fire. The king and queen ran to the Église Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois and asked the priest to bring the Holy Sacrament to the scene. Within minutes of the arrival, the winds changed away from the burning structure, and the guards were able to control it before it stretched any further. What was left behind was a hollow-out room that only the stone walls remained. The attic ceiling and vaults and walls and all the art was destroyed. Below, in the summer apartments of Anne of Austria, the gorgeous gilded and painted ceilings had been spared any damage, and the king's pavilion and Cardinal Mazarin's room escaped the fire but were consumed by the smoke. The show went on weeks later when the performance of the Ballet of Impatience was performed in the Grand Gallery on February 22nd with Louis XIV in the role of Jupiter. The start of the Grand Gallery was also severely damaged, and the entire pavilion would be rebuilt and would become the Salon Carré in the years that followed. A few of the paintings had been removed for the construction of the stage, but even that is unknown to this day. For many years, a large painting of Marie de Medici by Franz de Pourbus that hangs in the Louvre was believed to be one of the ones that graced the east wall as you enter the Galerie des Rois. It was painted around 1610 by the Flemish artist Pourbus, who had also painted the king and queen before. The queen in her coronation robe and crown fits the description of how the queens were depicted in the Galerie des Rois. The width of the painting is what puts it in doubt, as it is too large to have been able to fit between the two pillars of the room, but we may never know. You could see the painting in room 803, the Richelieu ring, around the corner of the amazing Marie cycle that was done by Rubens. In the same room as the portrait of Marie is a smaller version of a painting of Henry IV, also by Pourbus, that wasn't associated with the Galerie des Rois, but it's just adorable to see him. Immediately after the fire, the king ordered the room rebuilt. Much to the delight of Louis Lavaux, his early designs, which had been developing, was given the green light and full steam ahead. Maybe too quickly. Lavaux's vision cut a few corners along the way when it came to the structure of the roof that would have to be fixed many years later, but it's really the interior of this room that shines. The entire upper floor had to be rebuilt and designed to blend in with the building below with a few changes, and even a return of some of the original design motifs. The entire exterior of the Louvre is a giant puzzle dating all the kings and emperors that had touched it, with one surprising thread running through it: continuity. While each ruler wants to leave their mark, they have all kept Henry IV's grand design in mind of the overall theme. On closer inspection, you could see the initial of many of the kings, especially the H of Henry IV and the N of Napoleon III. The construction of the Petite Galerie was finished in 2 years, and as early as May 1663, the sculptors of the many stucco elements of the ceiling were brought in to bring the ceiling to life, all from the vision of painter Charles Lebrun. 3 years later, the sculptor work was complete, and Lebrun began painting, but it would all come to a screeching halt in 1671 when Louis XIV left Paris and the Palais du Louvre behind for the Versailles. We know the space today as the Galerie d'Apollon that was struck by tragedy again on a Sunday morning around 9 a.m. on October 19, 2025. As the thieves escaped the balcony created in 1663 by Louis Lavaux, they attempted to light the vehicle on fire, destroying the evidence. Thankfully, the security was gaining ground, and they dropped the torch before it could be lit. I hate to think what might have happened if they had been successful. Last week, when the monumental carpets created for the Grand Gallery were displayed at the Grand Palais, one of the Apollo carpets, recently restored, was also presented. They were ordered by Jean-Baptiste Colbert in 1626. The 13 carpets of the Galerie d'Apollon were ordered first, long before the Grand Gallery. The designs of the ceiling and the theme of Apollo are reflected in the carpets. The icons and symbols of the sun god Apollo, the lyra, bow, arrows, torches, each surrounded by laurel wreaths, are in the center of each carpet. Woven by Simon Lordet, the official carpet maker of the king, who had set up a large atelier in the soap factory just down the river from the Seine, created these and had them finished. Unlike the Grand Gallery carpets, these carpets of the Apollo Gallery were actually laid in the space for one occasion. In 1666, just after the completion, they were presented as the king walked through, checking on the progress of his glorious room. The Louvre still holds one in its collection, and you could find it today in Salle 604 on the first floor of the Sully wing. And the other two adjoining rooms will have the two Grand Gallery carpets back after the exhibit. Apollo was born from the ashes. If it wasn't for the fire, the Petite Galerie may never have become the beautiful Apollo Gallery that we know today. At this time, the Apollo Gallery is still closed to the public, and no word on when it will be reopening since the date of the theft. A deep dive into the ceilings and all of those amazing portraits on the side walls that I love that are actually woven tapestries will come as soon as we get back into that room, because I want to bring it to you with video and show you each of the details of this. A little update on the theft. We got maybe some good news out of the reports and actually from the Louvre. On October 20th, the day after the theft, they had announced that we had known that the imperial crown had been recovered that belonged to Empress Eugenie, that I also did the first episode of the podcast about. It was recovered, and over the last few months they looked at it and did deep investigation to see if they could bring it back to life, and they announced just last Wednesday that they will in fact reconstruct it. It was crushed by the hand of the crook wearing the yellow vest. He violently grabbed it off of its little wire base, pulled it out of the case, and threw it in the bag. When they were leaving, somehow it fell out, thankfully, and landed in the moat below the window of the Galerie d'Apollon. And they could not retrieve it, thankfully. And so it was found and saved. Of this crown, one of the 8 diamond-encrusted palmettes had fallen off inside the Galerie d'Apollon, but thankfully was recovered. But one of the imperial eagles is missing, sadly. Of the 1,354 diamonds, a dozen of the small stones along the band are missing. After the theft, many of the French historic jewelry houses reached out to the Louvre, offering their assistance. And so after the investigation, they have announced that it will be restored, and an advisory committee of Louvre officials and other people in the jewelry world, including Anne Dion, who is the deputy director of the Objet d'Art department, underneath Olivier Gabet, who this woman knows those jewels inside and out. She has been an integral part in getting many of these jewels back to the Louvre through auctions and donations. And there's probably nobody that was as gutted as Anne was with the theft that occurred that morning. I have been in the private library of the Objet d'Art section, and she walked by me, and it was like George Clooney was walking by me. I was so excited. So she is she is a gift and amazing with the information that she has and knows about each one of these jewels. And so it's fantastic that she's going to be the one involved with picking one of the historic houses, including Cartier, Boucheron, Van Cleef, are just some of the ones that are said to be in the running to restore it. Now, if you're coming to Paris this spring, which hopefully you are, and for some reason it seems like everybody under the sun is coming mid-April to the beginning of May. And if you are and you want a tour, reach out quickly for that. But if you are coming and you love the exhibits in the museums as much as I do, there are some great ones coming up, and pretty much all of the major museums, the exhibits close in late January, and the new ones open in the spring. And there's a few of them that I want to keep on your radar that you might want to see. On March 17th, the Musée d'Orsay is going to open 2 exhibits dedicated to Renoir. One is going to be paintings and one is going to be drawings, and that should be amazing. They're saying it's going to be one of the biggest Renoir exhibits ever. And Renoir has come under attack in recent years. A lot of people, and I know a lot of people in the art world, and they will say like, oh, he's overrated, or he was a sellout because he was, taking commissions for portraits. But I mean, you could spot a Renoir a mile away, and so many of these artists, look at Van Gogh, look at all these artists that didn't become anything of note while they were alive, sadly. And then after they died, have become these, massive, you know, artists that people collect and spend millions and millions of dollars on. And Renoir actually was able to do some of that while he was alive. So, his stuff is very soft and very feminine, but like I said, you could spot it a mile away, and I'm super excited to see that. Also, in March at the Grand Palais is going to be a massive exhibit dedicated to Matisse, which should be fantastic. At the Orangerie, a favorite of mine, it's a lot, many people might not know who this is. Henri Rousseau. He was a naive painter. He actually worked as a tax collector on the edge of Paris at one of the gates, and he would paint at night. And he was just a self-taught artist. And they have an exhibit at the Orangerie opening on March 25th. They hold a few of his paintings in there in their permanent collection. So I'm super excited about this one. We know him today because of Picasso, because back then, artists, when they were in need of getting painting supplies, they would take in canvases that they already painted to, art shops, and were able to trade that in for new canvases. And one day, Picasso walked into an art shop and saw a painting and said, "Hey, who is that?" And they told him. And Picasso went and found Rousseau and had a big party for him at the Bateau Lavoir with all the movers and shakers of Paris at the time and the art world. And suddenly, everybody knew who Henri Rousseau was. So he does very... I love his stuff because there's something kind of childlike and just happy of the stuff that he does. I just love it. So I can't wait for that one. For the unicorn fans out there, the Cluny Museum is going to have a exhibit opening March 10th dedicated to unicorns. Of course, the Cluny is the spot that holds the tapestries of the unicorn. And then my beloved Louvre will have an exhibit opening on April 15th dedicated to Rodin and Michelangelo. In recent years, they did a Rodin and Picasso at both the Rodin and Picasso Museum. So I'm imagining it's going to be a little like that, but I'm excited to see that. And I'm imagining it's probably going to be a lot of sketches and designs. So we'll see. That one's going to be really great, and that opens on April 15th. All of these I would recommend, except for maybe the Cluny, to get tickets in advance if it's something you really want to see, because I think they're all going to be rather popular. So thank you so much for joining me. And boy, do I hope this was the lucky time it recorded. And I will see you next week, and have a wonderful Valentine's Day. And, do something special, even just for yourself. Maybe some chocolate. That's what my grandma would do. All right. Thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing and talking to you next week.